In our study of the intertestamental period between the Old and New Testament, we've come to the second century BC, and in particular, we've been talking in the last couple of class periods about the struggle that ensued after the division of Alexander the Great's kingdom among at least four of his generals. Following his death, the empire was kind of divvied up between, again, four of Alexander's generals. And in particular, we're focusing on the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire. Of course, the Seleucid or Syrian Empire would have been north of Israel, up in the Asia Minor region and around that area, capital in Antioch. The Ptolemaic Empire south of Israel in the northern regions of Egypt. But those two empires went back and forth, struggling for control of territory. And Israel was kind of caught there in the middle in the crosshairs. We're going to continue the study of that time period today. Last week we talked some about a Syrian or Seleucid ruler that had come to power there in the second century BC named Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a notable figure in secular history as well as biblical history, as we're going to see. We did mention the process known as Hellenization. We want to talk more about that as we begin our class today. Hellenization, of course, was that historical spread started with Alexander the Great. It was his desire as he conquered empires and spread his empire to the far reaches of the known world in his day to spread Greek culture and learning and language as well. And that became the predominant culture at the time. That affected even the land of Israel. Again, for a time it was under the rule of the Ptolemies, and then due to some battles it came under the reign of the Seleucids or the Syrians, and that's kind of where we left off. But the response to this spread of Greek culture was mixed among the Jewish people of the day. It affected Judea and Jerusalem as well. There was a push, even among many of the Jews, to accept this Greek culture, but it wasn't. Not everyone was a fan of it, as we'll go on to see. I believe we mentioned some rulers that were put in place by Antiochus IV. He was, for a stretch of time there, maybe about 50 years, ruler over the Judean region. And we mentioned that due to his losses to Rome up in the Aegean region, Rome charged him with indemnities. And Antiochus had to come up with like taxes to pay to Rome to maintain the peace with them. So he not only did lose territory, but now he's got these bills to pay as well. And that comes to play in the history of God's people, because there arose among the pro-Hellenist group, they desired to rise to power among God's people, and they come into play. There was a man named Jason who was the brother of the high priest Onias III. He offered Antiochus a sum of money if he would make him high priest in his brother's place. And of course, when offered this bribe, if you will, Antiochus needed the money, so he said, "Sure, Jason, you can be this high priest over the Jews." But as power and money come into play, you've got other problems that come with it. Antiochus decided to side with the Hellenized Jews in order to consolidate his empire and to strengthen his hold over the region. He wasn't just trying to Hellenize the Jews, but really to totally eliminate all traces of Jewish culture. Of course, the Jews in many cases rebelled against his decrees. We'll see later as history plays out, it's going to get worse. Here's one example of, this unholy union between Antiochus and those that bribed him to come to power over the Jews. Antiochus, used Jason's power as high priest over the Jewish people to build a gymnasium just outside the temple precinct in Jerusalem. And with that, of course, that strengthens the whole of the Greek culture in the heartland of the Jewish community. And Jason, he was pro-Hellenist. He was all for that, but right close to the temple. This gymnasium, of course, was a symbol of Greek Hellenism, and having it outside the temple showed the Jewish community exactly who was in charge. So Antiochus has got some plans here. Part of the problem comes, though, as we read on. It says the Hellenistic idea of masculinity, it was shown in the rule that one must be naked to enter the gymnasium. Being naked in public, of course, was strictly forbidden among Jewish laws. So any Jewish person that went into the gymnasium violated the laws of the covenant people of God. Of course, Antiochus and his government understood this and therefore made it a legal requirement for anybody who could afford it to go at least once. So you see how he's starting to put pressure on the Jewish people here, requiring them by force basically to forego obeying their own rules. And that took place under the rule of Jason as high priest. But another pro-Hellenist supporter decided, well, if money can buy a position, I'll offer more money. A few years later, in 171 BC, a still more ardent Hellenizer named Menelaus, who did not belong to the correct priestly line. Jason, at least, was still in the family line that should have been a priest. Here, this Menelaus wasn't even part of that, but he offered Antiochus a larger sum of money if he would make him high priest in Jason's place. Once more, of course, the bribe is accepted, and for the future, no proper high priest among the priestly family ministered in Jerusalem. So I guess history hasn't changed so much as we track through this. You get money and politics and power involved, and you start to see abuses like this even among the people of God. Of course, Antiochus has other problems in his realm. He's, of course, trying to make up for his father's losses in the Aegean area. He does that by trying to annex Egypt to the Seleucid power, and that, of course, is his efforts to take over the Ptolemaic domain. But when he was on the brink of success in those efforts, he was decisively checked by Roman intervention in 168 BC. Let's trace that part of history. Let's back up just a little bit to kind of set the stage for what happens between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies down near Alexandria. Again, we've just talked about what was going on in Judea and the problems that come with that. After his accession to the throne, Antiochus took care to maintain good relations with the Roman Republic. As I've mentioned before, Rome was an up-and-coming power, and if you were a ruler in any part of the world there, you had to take Rome into account. So Antiochus took care to maintain good relations with the Roman Republic, sending an embassy to Rome in 173 BC with a part of the unpaid indemnity still owed from the 188 BC peace treaty made with them. While there, the embassy secured a renewed treaty of friendship and alliance with Rome, greatly helped by the fact that Antiochus had come to power with the help of Eumenes II, Rome's principal ally in the region. Now you get down into Egypt, and the Ptolemies got some things going on. The guardians of King Ptolemy IV, Philometor, demanded the return of the Syrian region, encompassing, of course, the area of Judea, by declaring war on the Seleucids on the assumption, rather, that the kingdom was divided after Antiochus's murder of his nephew. However, Antiochus had prepared a more thoroughly and planned and launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, defeating the Ptolemaic force and seizing Pelusium. He then advanced into Egypt proper, conquering all but Alexandria and capturing King Ptolemy. This was partly achieved because Rome was embroiled in another war somewhere else and was not willing to become involved elsewhere. To avoid alarming Rome, Antiochus allowed Ptolemy IV to continue ruling as a puppet king from Memphis. Upon Antiochus's withdrawal from the city of Alexandria chose a new king, one of Ptolemy's brothers. The Ptolemy brothers agreed to rule Egypt jointly instead of fighting a civil war. Now we come to 168 BC, and this is this second attack that Antiochus is going to make on Egypt. Antiochus led a second attack on Egypt and also sent a fleet to capture Cyprus. Before he reached Alexandria, his path was blocked by a single elderly Roman ambassador named Gaius Popilius Laelius, who delivered a message from the Roman Senate directing Antiochus to withdraw his armies from Egypt and Cyprus or consider himself in a state of war with the Roman Republic. And of course, that puts a whole different face on the issue, doesn't it? Antiochus has to respect the power of the Roman Empire, so now he's got a choice to make. Do I go ahead and continue my push into Egypt and endeavor to conquer it and incur the wrath of Rome, or should I back off? But he's confronted here by, a Roman senator. Antiochus said he would discuss it with his council, whereupon the Roman envoy drew a line in the sand around Antiochus and said, before you leave this circle, give me a reply that I can take back to the Roman Senate. So he's going to have none of this going back and talking it over. He says, you need to make your decision now. This implied, of course, that Rome would declare war if the king stepped out of the circle without committing to leave Egypt immediately. Weighing his options, Antiochus stepped out of the circle without committing, or weighing his options rather, Antiochus decided to withdraw. Only then did Popilius agree to shake hands with him. Now you might say, well, that's smart thinking, and I suppose militarily it was, but from what we know about Antiochus, he didn't like this at all. In fact, it enraged him in various ways. And as we're going to go on to see in history of this time, he's going to take out his anger at being embarrassed in front of his troops and being forced to kind of head back toward home with his tail between his legs. He's going to take out his anger on Jerusalem. According to the authors of the books of Maccabees, and that's some of those writings of the intertestamental period among the Jews, according to the authors of the books of Maccabees, while Antiochus was busy in Egypt, what we just talked about, these, Antiochus moving into Egypt and trying to take over there, while that was going on, a rumor was being spread back in Judea that Antiochus had been killed. Well, and that's, if that was true, that would leave a power vacuum, and as powerful men do, they start jockeying for position. Back in Judea, the deposed high priest, and that's Jason, remember, Jason offered a bribe and Antiochus took it till Menelaus come along. Even someone not in the priestly line offered him more money, and so Antiochus kicked Jason out. The deposed high priest Jason gathered a force of 1,000 soldiers and made a surprise attack on the city of Jerusalem. So here we've got Jews attacking their own city. Menelaus, of course, the high priest appointed last by Antiochus, was forced to flee Jerusalem during a riot. King Antiochus returned from Egypt in 168 BC, of course, enraged by his defeat there, and he attacked Jerusalem and restored Menelaus and then executed many Jews. This was a horrific time. As I said, Menelaus is on his way back home, and he's enraged, and not only for being embarrassed in Egypt, but now he's got the Jews in Judea and Jerusalem rising up against him, throwing out his appointed high priest, Menelaus. And you put all those things together, and Antiochus with his forces was ready to pour out his wrath, and he certainly did that. Here's some quotes from a historical source. Speaking of Antiochus, it says, he took Jerusalem by storm. He ordered his soldiers to cut down without mercy those whom he had met, and to slay those who took refuge in their houses. There was a massacre of young and old, a killing of women and children, a slaughter of virgins and infants in the space of 3 days, 80,000 people were lost, 40,000 meeting a violent death, and the same number being sold into slavery. That comes from 2nd Maccabees chapter 5, verses 11 through 14. But that's, as bad as that is, it was going to get worse. It's almost as if Antiochus has just decided to think of the worst things he can do to the Jews and do that in a brazen act of disrespect. As we've said before, it was Antiochus's policy, like the Persians before him, to kind of let the Jews govern themselves and have their rituals and rites and worship and sacrifices and all that. He was fine with that, but now that he's mad, he's going to take away that and disrupt it all. In a brazen act of disrespect, Antiochus raided the temple itself in Jerusalem, stealing its treasures, setting up an altar to Zeus, and even sacrificing swine on the altar. Can you think of anything more offensive to an observant Jew than to setting up an altar to a false god in the temple and sacrificing a pig on the altar? When the Jews expressed their outrage over the profaning of their temple, Antiochus responded by slaughtering a great number of the Jews and selling others into slavery. He issued even more draconian decrees, and here's some examples of that. Antiochus made the performing of the rite of circumcision punishable by death. Circumcision was a key part of the Old Covenant law. Now Antiochus says that anybody who circumcises someone else is due the death penalty. And Jews everywhere were ordered to sacrifice to pagan gods and to eat pig's flesh. Again, an angry man finding ways to humiliate a subjugated people, and it's going to come back to haunt him. And we'll have time to talk about that, Lord willing, next week in just a little bit. Again, this is right at about 168, 167 BC. These events recorded here that we've looked at from the perspective of just wider spread historical sources, that is the word I'm looking for. There's an intersection with the biblical record. The Bible does make reference in passing somewhat to these events. And look with me in Daniel chapter 11. We looked at the book of Daniel quite a bit in this study of the intertestamental period because it has places that fit into the history, and we're going to see that again today. Although he's not mentioned by name, Antiochus and what he does and the history surrounding all of these events that we've just talked about today are recorded there prophetically. And as I think I mentioned last week, the prophecies are so specific and detailed, it leads a lot of historians looking at this account of Daniel, even some biblical scholars, to say, you know what, Daniel has to be written after the events, because nobody, especially if you're the type of person who says, I don't allow for miraculous prophetic things to happen. It's so specific and predictive that they say, well, this is just somebody writing that looking back at the events, rather than what I believe it to be. Daniel, by the power of God, looks ahead in time, and by God's power can make such a specific prophecy that comes true. But be that as it may, that's a different discussion for another time. Let's look quickly through Daniel chapter 11. Read through at least the first part of it. And again, Antiochus isn't mentioned by name, but as you'll see, I don't know that there can be any other people that this is affiliated with. It says in verse 1, it says, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. So this is Daniel. Still here in the reign of the Medes and Persians, but he prophesied some events that are going to come later. In verse 2, it says, and now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. Then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. And a few lessons ago, when we were talking about the Persian Empire, we talked about how It was the worldwide leader for time. Its empire stretched as big as basically Alexander the Great's. But yet, as time went on and successive kings over that empire came, and it became bigger, the need for taxes grew greater, and the final king, I believe his name was Darius. I can't remember which Darius. Anyway, Darius made a foray up toward the Grecian area and lost that battle, and that was the start of the push of the Grecians in, and that's what verse 2 is talking about. This king of the Medes and the Persians will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. He did that to his dismay. Now notice verse 3. Then, Daniel says, and a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. And that fits Alexander the Great to a T. We just talked about arousing the empire of Greece. A mighty king arose, and there was no king mightier, if you will, than Alexander the Great in his day. He certainly had great authority and did as he pleased. The premature death of Alexander is, of course, rehearsed even in elementary school textbooks, and the division of his empire into 4 parts assumed by 4 military leaders is well known. Daniel foresees this. Let's read on in verse 4. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides them. Historically, that's exactly what happened after the death of Alexander. He didn't have any heirs to pass it on to. And as it mentions there, his kingdom broken up, parceled out the 4 points of the compass, as we've seen historically. That's the division of his kingdom, primarily among these 4 generals. 2 of these divisions of Alexander's empire are prominent in the subsequent part of Daniel's vision here. And those are referred to in Daniel 5 and following as the king of the south and the king of the north. King of the south was Ptolemy. King of the north was the Seleucus, the Seleucid Empire, and the Ptolemaic Empire. These, we know them as the Seleucid and Ptolemaic dynasties. In Daniel chapter 11, verses 21 through 25, and by the way, let's just read down through the verses 5 of Daniel 11 through verse 20, just to kind of pick up the history of the struggle between these empires. It says, then the king of the south will grow strong along with one of his princes who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His dominion will be a great dominion. After some years, they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north and carry out a peaceful arrangement. But she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up along with those who brought her in, and the one who sired her, as well as the one who supported her in those times. But one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place and will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and will deal with them and display great strength. Also their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold he will take into captivity to Egypt. And he will, on his part, will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. So again, we won't take time to specifically follow these things out in history, but that's exactly what happened. This battle between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, back and forth. There was some intermarriage and all of that. Verse 9 says, then the latter will enter the realm of the king of the south, but will return to his own land. His sons will mobilize and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one of them will keep on coming and overflow and pass through, that he may again wage war up to his very fortress. The king of the south will be enraged and go forth and fight with the king of the north. Then the latter will raise a great multitude, and that multitude will be given into the hand of the former. When the multitude is carried away, his heart will be lifted up, and he will cause tens of thousands to fall, yet he will not prevail. For the king of the north will again raise a greater multitude than the former, and after an interval, some of the years, he will press on with a great army and much equipment. Now in those times, many will rise up against the king of the south. The violent ones among your people also will lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they will fall down. Then the king of the north will come, cast up a siege ramp, and capture a well-fortified city. and the forces of the south will not stand their ground, not even the choicest troops, for there will be no strength to make a stand. But he who comes against him will do as he pleases, and no one will be able to withstand him. He will also stay for a time in the beautiful land with destruction in his hand. He will set his face to come with the power of his whole kingdom, bringing with him a proposal of peace, which he will put into effect, which he will also give him. And he will also give him the daughter of women to ruin it, but she will not take a stand for him and be on his side. Then he will turn his face to the coastlands and capture many, but a commander will put a stop to his scorn against him. Moreover, he will repay him for his scorn. So he will turn his face toward the fortresses of his own land, but he will stumble and fall and will be found no more. And again, that's the history of this ongoing battle for several years there between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. Then, in his place, one will arise who will send an oppressor through the jewel of his kingdom, yet within a few days he will be shattered, though not in anger or in battle. All right, now that brings us up to the advent of Antiochus IV. In Daniel 11, verses 21 through 35, the prophet reveals the rise and the rule of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid king who reigned from 175 to 164 BC. Daniel's prediction involves the rise of Antiochus to power, the conflicts with Antiochus with Egypt, the king of the south, and his hostilities toward Israel. The demise of Seleucus IV, who preceded Antiochus's rise to power, happens, and Daniel prophesies the untimely end of Seleucus there in Daniel 11, verses 20 and 21. We just are reading about that, but notice what it says in verse 21. In his place, this is the king of the Seleucids before Antiochus, in his place a despicable person will arise, on whom the honor of kingship has not been conferred, but he will come in a time of tranquility and seize the kingdom by intrigue. And that certainly happens. You know, there was some assassinations and everything. There was an untimely death of the one just before Antiochus. He certainly was historically a contemptible person, as the verse says. My version says despicable person. And the history we've already talked about affirms that in so many ways. And we talked in the previous class that, in fact, he was mocked by many. He preferred to be called Antiochus IV Epiphanes, or God manifest. A play on words, they called him Antiochus Epimanes, the madman. He was not given an heir to the throne. Indeed, to him royal majesty has not been given. Antiochus didn't lead a bloody coup, but he obtained his kingdom, as it says there, by intrigue. These specific details, prophesied about 350 years before they transpired, were fulfilled in Antiochus IV Epiphanes. The time and manner of his rise to power are foretold in the book of Daniel, what we're reading right here in chapter 11. The conflicts of Antiochus IV with Egypt are predicted in Daniel 11, 22 through 30, which details are amazing. Let's just read those verses right quick. The overflowing forces will be flooded away before him and shattered, also the prince of the covenant. After an alliance is made with him, he will practice deception. He will go up and gain power with a small force of people. In a time of tranquility, he will enter the richest parts of the realm and will accomplish what his fathers never did, nor his ancestors. He will distribute plunder, booty, and possessions among them, and he will devise his schemes against strongholds, but only for a time. He will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south with a large army. So the king of the south will mobilize an extremely large and mighty army for war, but he will not stand, for schemes will be devised against him. Those who eat his choice food will destroy him, and his army will overflow, but many will fall down slain. As for both kings, their hearts will be intent only on evil, and they will speak lies to each other at the same table, but it will not succeed, for the end is still to come at the appointed time. Then he will return to his land with much plunder, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant, and he will take action and then return to his own land. At the appointed time, he will return and come into the south, but this last time it will not turn out the way it did before. All right, so that speaks of the previous time of Antiochus making his push into Egypt and coming back, and then he makes this last final foray that we just studied about earlier a little bit ago, where he's pushed back and the Roman envoy is there to draw the circle in the sand and challenge Antiochus, and he retreats. Notice what it says there in verse 30, Daniel 11, for ships of Kittim. And you'll note that is a reference to Rome in biblical history. For ships of Kittim will come against him, therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the holy covenant, and will take action so he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress. He will do away with the regular sacrifice, and they will set up the abomination of desolation. By smooth words, he will turn to godliness those who act wickedly toward the covenant, but the people who know their God will display strength and take action. And so you start to see this. Verse 33, those who have insight among the people will give understanding to the many, yet they will fall by the sword, by flame, by captivity, by plunder, for many days. Now when they fall, they will be granted a little help, and many will join them in hypocrisy. Some of them who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time, because it is still to come at the appointed time. And this speaks of the history we talked about just a bit ago of Antiochus returning from Egypt and taking out his fury on Jerusalem. He was turning people against the covenant, setting up this abomination of desolation, which in context there, of course, is setting up the altar of Zeus in the temple and offering a pig on the temple altar as well, profaning the temple and the fortress, taking away the sacrifices, forcing Jewish people to rebel against their own covenant. And so it's literally amazing to consider just how specific this prophecy came true in the time of Antiochus. We're going to stop there for today. We've got some interesting history to pick up on, though, because this very push of Antiochus against Jerusalem and all the abominations that came with it are going to cause a faction within the Jewish people themselves to rise up and ultimately overcome the Syrian or Seleucid, domination of the time. And it's referred to historically as the Maccabean Revolt. And Lord willing, we'll take an opportunity to look into that history next time. God bless. Have a great week.